I thought I'd like to read you a story as it's that spooky time of the year. So I've written you a story and I will record it now. Are you ready? It's called A Strange Time of Year. This all happened at the time of year when it gets misty and foggy in the morning and in the afternoon as it started to get dark. Large spiders' webs hung from one branch to another in the trees and from gates and hedges. Leaves were falling off the yellow and golden dressed trees, and the ground had become soft and slippery. It just happened to be this time of the year when the bus broke down. Jason and his sister Margaret were now in the high school and went off to school and came home together unless they had sports. But this never happened today. They were on their way home on the bus when it came to a halt and refused to move. The driver tried to coach the bus back into action, but it failed again and again. And so he turned around to the passengers on the bus and simply said, "You've got to get off." And they would have to walk or wait for the next bus coming. Neither Jason or Margaret fancied waiting around in the dusk, watching the light disappear altogether, and so they started the walk back to their house. This took them out of street lighting and onto the outskirts of the town, but it never bothered them. Part of the route took them past a very old, disused graveyard, mostly elegant Victorian monuments and stones, a little overgrown in places as the descendants of those passed on were no longer alive themselves, or they'd moved away and lived and died in far-flung places all round the world. As they came to the old graveyard, which was normally a very quiet and peaceful place, they could hear voices. It sounded like a group of people talking in an agitated fashion. "You won't mind if no one remembers. Many of us have birthdays that come and go. No one visits. We have no flowers of any kind of gifts. It's going to be all right, isn't it?" said a female. "What's going on here?" said Jason. "I'm sure I don't know, but if it's anything to do with the graveyard, I'm walking straight past," said Margaret. As they started to walk along the railings, past the tall stones and elegant monuments, they saw a movement towards the middle of the normally peaceful place. "Look, what's going on?" said Jason, as he grabbed Margaret's hand and he pulled her towards the entrance. "Come on, let's go and see what it's all about." No, I don't want to go and look. Let's go straight home." But Jason won, and the two of them went through the gate and walked past all the tall gravestones and towards the group of people standing around one of the oldest graves. They are in their Halloween costumes. Look, long skirts, and the men have jackets with tails, and several of them have walking sticks," said Margaret, who had resigned herself to visit the group of people in the graveyard. Further into the dark, damp place they walked, and as they did, it grew darker. Apart from the occasional small light on the pathways, and these were movement sensitive and came on as they walked along the path. Then all of a sudden, a dreadful howl filled the space, like the kind of thing you hear on one of those ghost trains at the fair. "Moo!" came the voice again. The group of people started to get very agitated, and despite both Jason and Margaret feeling very scared, they felt a pull towards the group. "What's going on?" they asked one of the people standing around the grave. "It's Charles. Every year at this time he expects a visit from his family, perhaps a bunch of flowers, or a card, a candle in a holder, just any little thing to let him know they remember him," but they never came," said one of the men. Now, you'd have thought by now that he would have reminded the two children that Halloween was coming and all that entailed, but for the moment all thoughts of that had disappeared, and they simply stood and listened. "No!" came the cry again, this time much louder. "Is it a ghost?" asked Margaret. One of the women turned round and she smiled and started to tell them the story. It was a sad one. Charles had died very suddenly, just dropped dead when his heart stopped working. In all honesty, he had been overeating and over-drinking for years. But regardless of that, he never had any member of his family with him. He died all alone. And then, when he settled into his resting place in the graveyard, he expected to have visits from his family. Flowers, candles in holders, cards perhaps, but nothing came. And when it neared All Hallows Eve, when the veil was much thinner, he could be heard, in the same way that all the others could be seen. Margaret and Jason listened to the story very carefully and then said, "So if he were to get a visit from one of his descendants, he would stop howling?" "Yes, I think he would," said the woman. Margaret opened her school bag and took out a pencil and a piece of paper. She drew a rose, and underneath it she wrote, "For Charles," and put it under a stone on the grave. "There you are. It's a token for now." Jason said he would do some research and see if he could trace the family of Charles Hunter, who died in 1925, suddenly, the father of Raymond and Janet and the husband of Jane Ross. Jason quickly wrote all these things down on one of his notebooks. And then the two of them turned away, walked back out of the graveyard, and after saying, "See you later," to the people standing around the old grave, off they went. They never spoke to each other on the way home. All that had happened was going round inside their heads, and they were trying to come to terms with it, that ghosts really did haunt graveyards in the dusk and the dark. Once they arrived back at home, they changed out of their school uniform, sorted out their school bags, getting their homework ready. Luckily, neither of them had very much to finish this evening. Both of them had all this done in just over an hour. Jason opened up his laptop and started right away to see if he could find any information regarding Charles Hunter. And sure enough, they found his death certificate and an old newspaper article which did say he died suddenly and would be greatly missed. Then he wrote down the dates and opened up a family history research site and started to search for a Raymond Hunter and a Janet Hunter. Soon they found them living on the other side of the town, and then they went on to find marriages, another generation, and another. Eventually they came to another Charles who lived and worked in the town. Jason sent him an email and asked if he wouldn't mind getting in touch about an ancestor. Margaret listened to all of this once she was told about the research, and then asked how they were going to say that this was a ghost. Silence. Both looked at each other. "We need Mum's help," and they both said, and off they went downstairs to find Mum, who was in the kitchen. "Mum, we have a problem. Can you help?" they both said together. "Whatever is the problem that brings you both here, let's have a cup of tea, and you can tell me all about this," said their mum. "So, let me get this right. There is a ghost haunting a graveyard, And you want to stop this by trying to find the descendants and persuade them to visit their ancestor's grave. Yes, and over the next few days, as it's nearly Halloween, in fact, it is Halloween, when lots of children and mums and dads will be walking around, going from one house to another for trick-or-treating, and they're going to get a very bad shock if they hear Charles yell. And you've both heard this and spoken to a group of people who told you this story. Tell me why they couldn't do this themselves, asked Mum. Jason said he would go back tomorrow, maybe meet up with the descendants of this ghost and find some way of getting him to visit, as it was a Saturday tomorrow. The next day they went up to the graveyard just about the same time as the day before, taking with them a small bunch of flowers in a metal jug. Their dad had found them, and as they walked towards the grave of Charles Hunter, the people who'd met them yesterday joined them, walking from all sorts of different paths along the old graveyard. No! Came a howl, and everybody got agitated until they saw the two young people walking towards them from the main gate. Jason and Margaret said hello, and Jason quickly popped the flowers up against the gravestone and stood back. Lovely, came a very deep voice from below the ground. And as they looked up at the people gathered around the grave, it started to get very misty, and one by one they disappeared. Oh, said Margaret, we've been talking to ghosts all the time. Looking around them, the mist started to clear, and the old graveyard became peaceful and empty. Where did they go? Asked Jason, and to this day he can't explain this happening. But they did go on to meet up with the descendant of Charles Hunter, and he did visit the grave and said he would come about twice a year. On the date of the death of Charles Hunter, and again at Halloween, when the veil was very, very close. That's the space between the worlds. It was very thin, and ghosts walked the streets.